There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. I have lived inside ordinary silence. The silence of an empty house. The silence of a hospital corridor. The silence of a grave. I know what those sound like. They have weight. They press against you. But on the morning of March 1st, 2006, I opened my son's bedroom door at 6 in the morning, and I found a silence of a completely different nature. It was full, dense with something I had no language for. My son Carlo was on his knees beside his bed, a notebook open on the mattress in front of him, his pen moving slowly across the page as though he were not writing but transcribing, as though the words were coming to him from somewhere other than his own mind. He didn't hear me open the door. He didn't notice me standing there for nearly a full minute, watching him. The lamp on his desk cast a warm, amber light across his face, and I noticed something I had never seen before, or perhaps had never allowed myself to truly see. He looked ancient. Not old. Ancient. Like someone who had been carrying knowledge for a very long time, and was only now being permitted to set it down. That was Ash Wednesday, the first day of his last Lent. I didn't know it then, but Carlo, I believe now, already did. If you have ever been in the presence of someone who knows something you don't, something enormous, something that changes the architecture of everything, then you will understand the feeling that moved through me in that doorway. A stillness, a kind of held breath in the universe. Stay with me, because what my son told me that morning in 19 words changed not just the way I practice my faith, it changed the way I understand what faith is. My name is Antonia Salzano. I am 54 years old, and I am Carlo Acutis' mother. I want to say that plainly without drama, because what I am about to share has nothing to do with being special or chosen or remarkable. I was simply his mother. I made his lunches and washed his school uniform and occasionally argued with him about leaving his sneakers by the front door. I was ordinary in every way that matters. Carlo was born on May 3, 1991, in London. We were an Italian family living temporarily in England, and he arrived into the world with dark eyes that already seemed to be looking at something slightly beyond whatever was immediately in front of him. We moved back to Milan when he was very young, and it was in that city, in its cathedrals and side streets and ordinary apartment, at a kitchen table that needed refinishing and never got it, that Carlo became who he became. By the time he was 12, he attended Mass every single day. This was not something his father or I required of him. It was something he required of himself. He would set his alarm, rise before either of us, and walk to the church 2 blocks from our building. Sometimes I would watch him leave from the window of our bedroom, this small boy in jeans and his beloved sneakers, his backpack over one shoulder, walking with the quiet urgency of someone who had somewhere genuinely important to be. He was, at the same time, obsessed with computers. Not in the way that worried me, not lost in games or isolated behind a screen, but productive, purposeful, almost architectural in his approach to technology. He taught himself web design and began cataloging Eucharistic miracles from around the world. Documented cases in which the host had physically transformed, in which science had examined the unexplainable and been forced to record what it found without being able to explain it. He built an entire exhibition, photographs, documents, historical records, that would eventually travel to dozens of countries. My son, in other words, was someone who believed that faith and evidence were not enemies, that the supernatural did not retreat from scrutiny, it invited it. He wore sneakers, he played video games on weekends, he laughed loudly and often. He loved animals with an almost embarrassing tenderness. We had cats, and he spoke to them as though they understood everything, and I am not certain they didn't. This is who opened his notebook on Ash Wednesday, 2006. This is the boy who looked up from the page and saw me in the doorway and said, with a smile that I still carry in my chest like a warm stone, "Mama, I was hoping you'd come. Sit down. I need to explain something to you." I want you to understand. Carlo said this often. He was always explaining something. A new miracle he'd catalogued. A passage of scripture that had surprised him. A thought about the nature of time or the physics of prayer. I was used to sitting across from my son and having the floor quietly shift beneath me. But that morning was different. I knew it before he said a word. Before I tell you what Carlo said, I need to tell you what I brought into that room without knowing I was carrying it. Because the truth is, I had spent years performing my faith without truly inhabiting it. I don't say this with shame. I say it because I think it is more common than we admit. And because if I am being honest with you, that honesty is the only thing that makes this story worth telling. I had grown up Catholic in the way that many Italians of my generation grew up Catholic. Baptized, confirmed, married in the church, present at Mass on Sundays and holy days, going through the gestures and the prayers with the careful correctness of someone who has memorized the steps of a dance but no longer hears the music. Lent, in particular, had become a kind of annual performance. I gave something up, usually chocolate, once caffeine, once, and I am not proud of this, I gave up a television program I had already finished watching. I kept a kind of spiritual ledger in which the modest inconveniences of 40 days could be exchanged, at Easter, for the sense of having completed something. I went to Mass on Ash Wednesday, received the cross on my forehead, and felt, for a moment, moved, touched by the gravity of it, the ashes, the reminder of mortality. And then I drove home and made lunch and went on with my life. Underneath this practiced faith was something I had never examined clearly. A bone-deep uncertainty about whether any of it was actually real. Not the teachings. I believed the teachings. Not the history. I believed the history. But the presence. The intimate, immediate, personal presence of God in an ordinary life. The idea that heaven was not a destination, but a relationship. That the sacred was not sequestered in churches and feast days, but was threaded through the fabric of ordinary Tuesday mornings. I doubted that, quietly, consistently, for most of my adult life. And then Carlo arrived. It is difficult to be a rationalist about the supernatural when your child, at age 7, comes home from his first Mass and announces, with complete calm, that he has felt Jesus. Not seen, felt, as a presence, as warmth on the left side of his chest, which he described with the precision of a child reporting a physical sensation. Like when you hold my hand, but on the inside. I smiled. I said, "That's beautiful, Carlo." And then I went to the kitchen and stood very still for a moment, because something in the way he said it had slipped past my defenses. Over the years, I watched him. I watched the faith that lived in him. Not the performance of faith, not the careful observance of it, but the lived thing, the breathing thing, the thing that shaped his actual choices on actual days. He chose kindness over convenience. He chose the difficult person, the ignored student, the lonely classmate. He gave his lunch. He gave his time. He gave with the easy generosity of someone who has genuinely understood that giving costs nothing compared to what it returns. And still, I lived inside my doubt. Even surrounded by evidence I couldn't explain, I chose the simpler interpretation. He was a good boy, an unusual boy, a spiritually gifted boy. But the heaven he seemed to inhabit so easily, the closeness of the divine that he spoke about with such casual certainty, remained for me abstract, theoretical, a place I believed in the way I believed in countries I had never visited. By the time Carlo was 14, I had begun to feel a private guilt about this. He would say something about the Eucharist, something luminous, something that made the priests in our parish go quiet, and I would nod and feel, beneath the nod, a hollow sensation. He has this. I don't. What am I missing? I had tried. I had prayed more intentionally. I had attended extra masses during Lent, added the Stations of the Cross, fasted with genuine commitment, and I had felt better, calmer, more disciplined. But not closer. Not the closeness Carlo described so naturally, as though it were obvious, as though it would be strange not to feel it. I was the mother of a future saint, and I felt spiritually hollow. That is what I carried into his room on Ash Wednesday morning. Carlo patted the space on the bed beside him, and I sat down. The notebook was open to a page covered in his handwriting. Neat, unusually neat for a 14-year-old boy, the letters small and even, with occasional underlines and what appeared to be diagrams. He had been awake long enough to fill 2 full pages. "How long have you been up?" I asked. He glanced at the window, where the sky outside was still a deep, pre-dawn blue. "A while," he said. I had a lot to write down. "What is it?" He held the notebook against his chest for a moment, like someone holding something warm. "Do you know why Jesus chose 40 days in the desert, Mama? Not 30, not 50, specifically 40? I gave him the catechism answer. 40 years in the desert for the Israelites, 40 days of Noah's reign, 40 the number of preparation and testing in Scripture. He nodded. "Yes, all of that is true, but there is something else, something I don't think gets explained very often. Something about what happens spiritually, what happens in the real world, when the whole church enters those 40 days together." He turned to me with that expression he sometimes had, focused, serious, a little urgent, and said, "Mama, the veil between heaven and earth gets thinner during Lent, not because God changes, because we do." I looked at him. 14 years old, in his pajamas, on his knees a moment ago taking dictation from somewhere I couldn't see. "Tell me," I said, and he did. "If you have ever felt during Lent that your prayers carry further, that there is a quality to the silence of those 40 days that feels different from ordinary time, I want you to know that what Carlo explained to me that morning may be the reason why. And if you are walking into Lent carrying what I was carrying, the hollow performance, the practiced gestures, the quiet suspicion that the closeness others describe is simply not available to you, then I want you to know, this story is for you specifically. I believe you were meant to hear it. Before I continue, if something in these first few minutes has already touched a place in you that's been waiting to be touched, I created something for you. It's called 7 Days with Carlo. 7 days of his wisdom, his prayers, his way of inhabiting each ordinary morning as if it were sacred ground. It's in the description below. It will still be there when this story ends. But I wanted you to know it exists. Now, let me tell you what my son said. Carlo opened his laptop. This was always a kind of ceremony with him. Not casual, not reflexive, the way most teenagers open their devices. He opened it with intention, the way you open a reference book when you are preparing to make an argument. On the screen was a diagram he had made. It looked, at first glance, like something from a physics textbook. Concentric circles radiating outward from a central point, with annotations in his careful handwriting along the edges. "This is a year," he said, pointing to the outer ring. "And this," he pointed to a segment of the circle marked with a small cross, "is Lent." He looked at me to make sure I was following. "During an ordinary week," he said, "the faithful pray, but they pray individually. Each person has their own intention, their own timing, their own frequency, you could say. Like radio stations all broadcasting at once, all on different wavelengths. Beautiful, God hears everyone, but dispersed." He typed something, and the diagram animated. Dozens of small points of light appeared around the ring, each pulsing at a slightly different rate. But then Lent begins. He pressed a key. The pulsing points of light began, slowly, to synchronize. Not perfectly, not all at once, but gradually, over what he had labeled as the first 2 weeks of Lent, They moved toward the same rhythm. By the diagram's representation of Holy Week, they were beating as one. 2 billion Catholics, Carlo said. All fasting on the same days, all attending the same masses, all saying the same prayers, the Stations of the Cross, the Psalms of Penitence, the preparation for Easter, all pointed toward the same moment, the resurrection. He looked at me. Jesus said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." Mama, what happens when 2 billion are gathered? I didn't have an answer. I was looking at the diagram and feeling something I couldn't name, a kind of resonance in my sternum, like a string being plucked. The capacity to receive increases, Carlo said. Not God's willingness to give, that never changes, but our ability to receive what He is always already offering. The collective intention creates what I think of as... He paused, searching for the right phrase. A spiritual antenna, a structure built by billions of individual acts of devotion, pointing heavenward, strong enough to carry what ordinary individual prayer sometimes struggles to carry. He sat back, apparently satisfied with the explanation, and reached for the glass of water on his nightstand. I sat for a moment with the image of 2 billion souls synchronized in devotion, creating something together that none could create alone. "Is this something you read?" I asked finally. He shook his head. "It's something I've been working on, from what I've observed in the Eucharistic miracles I've catalogued." He pulled up another file, a spreadsheet, dense with dates and locations. I've been cross-referencing the documented miracles with the liturgical calendar. Mama, a disproportionate number happened during Lent. Not just Holy Week, throughout the 40 days. As if the thinning you can feel in prayer is measurable in physical events. I leaned forward. "How many?" In my current catalog, 61% of the Eucharistic miracles I've documented occur during Lenten season or within the octave of Easter. He said this matter-of-factly, the way he might report a finding from a science experiment. It's too consistent to be coincidence. I want to tell you something that I have told very few people in the years since. Sitting beside Carlo that morning, watching him move between the theological and the empirical with the ease of someone for whom these were never separate categories, I felt, for the first time in my adult life, that the closeness I had been looking for was not somewhere I needed to travel. It was a frequency I needed to tune to. And that Lent, with its ancient structure, its collective rhythm, its 40 days of synchronized devotion, was the moment in the year when that frequency was loudest. I felt something shift, subtle, quiet, like a door opening somewhere inside me that I had assumed was locked. I didn't tell Carlo. He probably already knew. Over the following weeks, I watched my son live what he had explained. He rose each morning before dawn. He attended Mass. He fasted, genuinely, not performatively, and I noticed that his fasting had a quality that mine never had. It wasn't deprivation, it was clarity. He described it once as clearing the signal. As if the hunger was not an absence, but a tuning mechanism. He kept his Lenten diary. Each evening, he wrote in it for 30 minutes to an hour, recording what he called moments of nearness. Specific instances during the day in which he had felt the presence of God in a concrete, physical way. Not visions, not dramatic interventions. Small things. The quality of light through the church window during the consecration. A conversation with a classmate that had turned, without his intending it, toward something genuinely meaningful. An animal. Always, with Carlo. An animal that had appeared at a moment when he had been asking for reassurance. He showed me the diary once, in the 3rd week of Lent. I read several entries and felt myself growing very still, because the writing wasn't a teenager's writing. Not in style. The style was entirely Carlo, casual and precise and occasionally funny. But in content, in the depth of observation, in the quality of attention brought to bear on ordinary moments. One entry read, "Today during the consecration, I understood something about the word real. When we say real presence, we mean it more literally than we usually say things. Most of the time, real just means not fake. But in the Eucharist, real means something more like more real than anything else in the room. I have been trying to decide whether the Church becomes more present to the Eucharist, or the Eucharist makes everything around it more present. I think it is the second one. I think this is what happens during Lent, too. The practices don't make God more present to us. They make us more present to God. The frequency doesn't change. We change." I put the diary down and looked at my son, who was eating an apple at his desk, reviewing something on his laptop. 14 years old. "Carlo," I said, "do you ever worry about—" I wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "About carrying this much? About knowing this much?" He looked up. "About what?" "About where you're going." He held my gaze for a long moment. There was something in his expression that I have spent years trying to describe accurately. Not sadness, not fear. Something closer to a very great patience. The patience of someone who has already understood the ending and is present in the middle of the story, not because they don't know what comes next, but because the middle matters. Because now matters. "Mama," he said gently, "I'm not worried about where I'm going. I'm thinking about where you're going." I laughed because the alternative was to cry. "I'm your mother," I said. "I'm supposed to worry about you." "And I'm your son," he said. "I'm supposed to love you well." He went back to his laptop. I sat in the chair by his desk for another 20 minutes, pretending to read a magazine, not reading it at all. That was the third Wednesday of Lent, 31 days before Easter. 7 months and 9 days before I would stand in a hospital room and hold his hand for the last time. I have been asked over the years whether I knew, whether there was some maternal intuition operating beneath my conscious awareness that registered during that last Lent what was coming. I think the honest answer is yes. But it was knowledge without a name, a sensation of preciousness, a heightened awareness of each moment with him that I told myself was simply the effect of Lent, of the thinning he had described. The veil between heaven and earth growing more permeable, presence intensifying. I didn't understand that what I was feeling was not just the liturgical season. I was feeling his approaching departure making everything luminous. In the final week before Holy Week, Carlo did something unexpected. He came to me with his Lenten diary and asked me to read an entry, not to show me, but to read aloud to him. I found the page. The entry was dated Palm Sunday -7 days, the Sunday preceding the beginning of Holy Week. I read, "I have been thinking about preparation. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert preparing for his public ministry, which ended at Calvary and began again at the empty tomb. The desert prepared him not by making things easier, but by stripping away everything that wasn't essential. Hunger, silence, temptation, all of it removing what didn't need to be there so that what remained was only what was real. I think every Lent is a smaller version of this, not a performance, a preparation. For what exactly each person has to discover. But the preparation is real. The 40 days actually do something. They actually change the person who enters them honestly. I am grateful for this Lent. I feel prepared in a way I didn't feel before. I don't know yet what I'm prepared for, but I'm not afraid." When I finished reading, I looked up. Carlo was watching me with those dark eyes that had always seemed to be looking at something slightly beyond whatever was immediately in front of him. "Thank you, Mama," he said. I didn't ask why he had wanted me to read it aloud. I think now that he wanted to give me the words in my own voice. He wanted them to live in me, not just in him. He was preparing me. He had been preparing me all Lent. Easter came. Carlo entered it with a joy that I can only describe as earned, not the relief of having endured something difficult, but the expansiveness of someone who had used 40 days well and arrived at the feast genuinely renewed. At the Easter Vigil, I watched him at the moment of the Gloria, when the church bells ring after the weeks of Lenten silence, when the lights flood back and the organ fills the building, and I saw something on his face that stopped my breath. Not surprise, not even joy exactly. Recognition, like someone seeing, confirmed in front of them, something they had always known. Afterward, walking home through the Milan streets, he took my arm, not a childish gesture, but a deliberate one, almost formal, and said, "Mama, I want to tell you something about this Easter that I might not remember to say later." "Tell me." "The Lent worked. Do you understand what I mean? It wasn't just discipline. It wasn't just practice. Something actually opened. I am different tonight than I was 40 days ago, and the difference is real." I squeezed his arm. "I felt it too," I said, and I meant it. Something had shifted in me during those weeks, not dramatically, not all at once, but genuinely. The hollow performance had become something else, not perfect, not Carlo's luminous total presence, but real, the smallest beginning of real. "That's what I wanted you to know," he said. "That it works for everyone, not just for people like me, for everyone who enters it, honestly." We walked the rest of the way in silence. A good silence. One of the full ones. 5 months later, on the 1st of October, Carlo developed a fever that didn't break. I will not describe the following days in detail. I will only tell you that during his final illness, in those last 12 days, Carlo was more present than I have ever seen a human being be. He asked for the Eucharist every day. He spoke to the nurses with a warmth that made them cry on their breaks. He told his father and me, separately, specific things he wanted us to know and to carry, things that could only have come from a clarity most people never achieve in a lifetime, let alone at 15. On October 11th, the night before he died, he held my hand and said, "Mama, do you remember what I told you on Ash Wednesday? About the veil getting thin?" I told him I remembered. "I think I've been living on the other side of it for a while now," he said. "It's not frightening. It's very bright." He died the following morning, October 12th, 2006. He was 15 years old. The leukemia had moved through him like weather, fast, total, unstoppable. He never lost his clarity. He never lost his peace. For several years after Carlo's death, I could not observe Lent without it becoming something it was not designed to be. An anniversary of grief. 40 days that ended not at Easter, but at October, at a hospital room, at a hand going still in mine. I prayed. I attended Mass. I went through the practices with the determination of someone building a wall against something threatening to break through. And the Lent that my son had described, the thinning, the collective antenna, the 40 days of genuine nearness, seemed inaccessible to me. I was present at the form of it and absent from the substance. This lasted until 2020, March 2020, the world in lockdown, churches closed, Easter celebrated in quarantine. I was alone in our apartment in Milan, the same apartment where Carlo had knelt by his bed with his notebook, on the morning of Ash Wednesday, March 5th, 2020. I had no access to Mass. I had ashes from the previous year in a small dish on the shelf. I marked my own forehead and sat at the kitchen table and opened Carlo's Lenten diary. I read his entry from March 2006, the one about frequency, about the 2 billion souls synchronized in devotion, creating together what none could create alone. And then I thought, we are all alone this year. Every Catholic in the world, for the first time in memory, observing Lent in isolation. No communal mass. No shared pew, no physical gathering. And I thought of what Carlo had written, "It makes us more present to God." I sat with that thought, and then I thought of something else, something that, in my grief and my distance from the living heart of his teaching, I had forgotten. Even separated, those 2 billion souls were entering the same 40 days. Even alone in apartments and houses and rooms, they were fasting on the same days, praying the same prayers, moving toward the same Easter. The antenna was still being built, not despite the isolation. Inside it, I began that morning to cry, not from grief, from something closer to recognition, the same expression I had seen on Carlo's face at the Easter Vigil 14 years before. I felt him, not as a hallucination, not as a dramatic apparition, but as a presence that I can only describe as adjacent. Close, warm, specific. The left side of my chest, exactly where he had described it at age 7. Like when you hold my hand, but on the inside. I understood, sitting at that kitchen table in a locked-down world, that he had given me the tools in March 2006 to survive March 2020. That the Ash Wednesday morning with the notebook and the diagram and the 2 billion lights pulsing into synchrony had been preparation, not just for his death, but for mine. For my life after his death. For the specific morning, 14 years later, when I would need to understand that the heaven he had always seemed to inhabit was not a place I had been excluded from. It was a frequency I had been taught to hear. I had simply taken 14 years to tune in. If you are ready to begin your own 40 days with this understanding, not Lent as discipline, but Lent as a collective act of tuning, as 2 billion souls building a structure capable of carrying what individual prayer sometimes cannot, I want to tell you about something I created in Carlo's memory. 7 Days with Carlo is not a book about his biography. You can read his biography elsewhere. This is something different. 7 days of practices drawn from his actual way of living. The small, precise, daily acts through which he maintained what he called the nearness. The morning prayers before dawn, the particular way he approached the Eucharist. The Lenten diary practice that produced the entry I read aloud on that Palm Sunday evening. 7 days, one at a time. The description below has everything you need. This is the right moment in my story to offer it to you, because what I'm about to tell you is what happened after I finally understood what Carlo had been teaching me. And I think some of you may want to begin your own 7 days before I finish. I began speaking about Carlo's Lenten theology in 2021, first at a small retreat in Milan, then at a parish conference in Rome, then, gradually, spreading in the way that genuine things spread, further. What I discovered, speaking to hundreds and then thousands of people, was that Carlo's insight resonated with a consistency that I found both moving and, honestly, a little overwhelming. Not because it was surprising to them, but because it named something they had already felt and had no language for. A priest in Brasilia named João Silva told me, "Since I began explaining to my congregation that Lent is a collective act of spiritual synchronization, that they are not 40 individuals trying to become more disciplined, but part of a 2 billion soul choir pointing heavenward together, our participation in the Lenten practices tripled, not because I made them feel guilty, because I made them feel connected." A psychiatrist in Buenos Aires named Dr. Maria Fernanda told me something that moved me even more. She works with patients experiencing what she calls spiritual depression, not clinical depression, but a specific variety of existential emptiness that has a distinctly spiritual character. She said, "When I tell my patients that during Lent, they are joined in their private prayer by 2 billion others praying in the same direction, the loneliness lifts. Not all of it, but enough." Carlo's insight is clinically useful, which should not surprise me, but it does, every time. A woman in Guadalajara named Elena, who had lost a child, told me that understanding the thinning, the nearness of heaven during Lent, had transformed the most difficult 40 days of her year into the days when she felt her daughter's presence most clearly. "I used to dread Lent," she said. "Now I wait for it." I tell you these testimonies because Carlo's insight was never meant to be a private teaching. He explained it to me on Ash Wednesday morning because he knew that I would carry it, but he didn't intend it to stop with me. He was, at 14, cataloging Eucharistic miracles for global distribution. He was building exhibitions intended for dozens of countries. He understood, intuitively, that spiritual truth has a duty to travel. I am his mother. I have tried to honor that duty. In the summer of 2025, Carlo was canonized. I was present at the ceremony in Rome. I stood in the square in the heat and the light, and I heard his name pronounced with the word saint attached to it. And I thought, as I always do when I hear that word applied to him, of the boy in the pajamas on Ash Wednesday morning, notebook open on the bed, explaining frequency and spiritual antennae, and 61% of Eucharistic miracles. And I thought, yes, of course, exactly. Not because sainthood surprised me. Because sainthood was simply the Church's formal recognition of something that anyone who knew Carlo had understood from the first serious conversation they had with him. He was, always, simply and entirely, pointing toward the nearness of heaven. Now the Church agrees. I am 54 years old. I have been Carlo's mother for 33 years and his survivor for 18. And I want to tell you the truest thing I know. The Lent that begins this week, or next week, or whenever you find yourself reading this, is not a performance. It is not a ledger of small sacrifices to be exchanged at Easter for the feeling of completion. It is not 40 days of discipline designed to make you a better version of the same person. It is a frequency. 2 billion souls, entering the same 40 days, moving toward the same mystery. Not all of them conscious of what they're doing. Not all of them understanding it the way Carlo understood it. But all of them, in their fasting and their prayer and their approaching of the Eucharist with whatever sincerity they can muster. All of them contributing to a structure that is larger than any of them individually. You are not alone in the desert. You have never been alone in the desert. The veil gets thin. Carlo told me this on the first day of his last Lent, and I have spent 18 years understanding the depth of what he meant. The closeness is real. The nearness is real. The heaven he inhabits, that he was always somehow already inhabiting, even when he was eating breakfast in his sneakers and laughing at something one of the cats had done, is not distant from you. It is on the other side of a veil that, for 40 days a year, grows almost translucent. If this story has reached you today, I don't believe it reached you by accident. I believe Carlo has a very particular way of finding the people who need what he has to give, and giving it to them in the form of a story, or a coincidence, or a morning when someone opens a door and finds someone kneeling with a notebook. You are someone's Ash Wednesday doorway. You showed up. Leave me a comment below. Tell me, what are you bringing into these 40 days? What do you need the nearness to touch? I read everyone. Carlo would want me to. Share this story with someone who is entering Lent without understanding what they are entering. Carlo's insight belongs to everyone willing to hear it. It traveled from him to me on a cold March morning in Milan. Let it travel further. And if you are ready to spend 7 days walking in his particular way of inhabiting the ordinary, the morning practices, the approach to the Eucharist, the evening diary of nearness, 7 days with Carlo is waiting for you in the description below. 7 days. Begin whenever you are ready. Carlo will meet you there. One last thing. I pray this every Ash Wednesday morning at 6 o'clock in the room where he knelt with his notebook. Carlo, patron of the internet and of young people who understood that faith and evidence were never enemies, who lived inside the nearness you described and tried to teach it to everyone within reach. Pray for us who are tuning our frequency. Pray for us who are entering the 40 days with empty hands and hollow places and the hope that the thinning you described is real. We are listening. Show us how to receive what heaven is always already sending. Amen.